Okay, good morning. And in keeping with the July holidays of Canada Day being July 1st and 4th of July in America, my name is Evan Weiner. My background is radio and TV, and I have a question for you if you know anything about the War of 1812. And that's what we're going to talk about in keeping with the holidays of July. The war was between the United States and Canada. Who won the War of 1812?
The United States and England, I thought.
It was the United States and England. So you got the answer. If you go to Canada, and I was in Canada in 2008, and we were on a tour. This was a special tour done for reporters back in June of 2008, and we were doing a tour of Ottawa, and we were going past the Parliament, and we were going through all of Assembly Row, or Embassy Row rather, and the tour guide said to us, "Who won the War of 1812? And I said, "Well, who did?" She said, "We did." I said, "How could you win something when you weren't even a country in 1867, until 1867? But anyway, it was a draw. Nobody really won. The Americans went back to where their borders were, the British went back to where their borders were, and there'd be other disturbances throughout the years, but nobody won this war. It's a trick question, and the roots of this start in Quebec City. Anybody been to Quebec City? Beautiful city, right?
Yeah.
With the walls. The American Revolution arguably begins on the plains of Abraham in Quebec City. And this is the War of 1812, and this is kind of a useless picture because the war was over when Andrew Jackson had that spectacular victory at the Battle of New Orleans. In June of 1812, the United States declared war on Great Britain in reaction to three issues: the British economic blockade of France, the impressment of thousands of neutral American seamen into the British Royal Navy against their will, and the British support of hostile Indian tribes along the Great Lakes frontier. 36-year-old America declared war for a second time against Great Britain. The plan this time, well, to annex all of Canada. But then again, there's no Canada right now, so you can't annex something that doesn't exist. But the plan was to conquer British North America or Canada and wrest all of North America for the United States once and for all. It never happened.
So that was British?
Yeah, it was British. That was British. But the United States did not have claim to all of North America because the Southwest was all, well, at this point, Spanish and Mexican territory. And French, well, the French were gone by this point, 1803, but Spaniards still had a great deal of the land in North America. And the Pacific Northwest was kind of no man's land. It was British, had been Spanish, but nobody really took control of that, where Portland and Seattle are today. Now, a faction of the U.S. Congress made up of mostly Western and Southern congressmen. They were called the War Hawks, had been advocating for the declaration of war for several years. And Americans like Thomas Jefferson, who is no longer president at this point, thought that the British North Americans would greet them with open arms. They didn't. The White House was burnt down in August of 1814. That's one of the things that happened during this war. It goes up in flames. The Federalists, though, especially New Englanders who relied on trade with the British, accused the war advocates or the war hawks of using the excuse of maritime rights to promote their expansionist agenda. There were New England politicians who said, "You know what, I think we've had enough of the United States. This 36-year experiment, it's not working out all that well. Maybe we should just go out on our own and start the country of New England on our own." But they never did. But the thought was there. And most of the war was fought around the Great Lakes. This is Mackinac Island. It's in Michigan, and this was one of the scenes of the battles during War of 1812. And this is when I was there that day 8 years ago. This was a recreation of one of the battles where the Brits took over Mackinac Island in Michigan. In the months following the U.S. declaration of war, American forces launched a three-point invasion of British North America or Canada. Actually, Canada just kind of ended it was called Western Canada at that point in Ontario, all of which were repulsed. At sea, the United States was more successful, and the USS Constitution and other American frigates won a series of victories over British warships. In 1813, American forces won several key victories in the Great Lakes region, where Britain regained control of the sea and blockaded the eastern seaboard. So anybody know who this guy is? He is Major General Robert Ross, British. And his objective, let's get rid of this, the White House. Let's burn it down if we can. And it would be General Ross whose troops would burn down the White House. It's 1814, and Washington, D.C. fell to the British in August. In Washington, British troops burnt the White House, the Capitol, and other buildings in retaliation for earlier burnings of government buildings in what is now Toronto, at that point York, Ontario, by United States soldiers. So it's retribution. And Dolly Madison is running through the White House trying to save whatever she could save because the British are coming, the British. Well, that was a different war, the British are coming. But they came and they conquered. And they were going up the Baltimore-Washington Expressway, which wasn't the Baltimore-Washington Expressway in those days, but they're headed straight to here, Baltimore, and Fort William McKendree. And that's an old picture because this guy in the picture now is 40 years old. This is when we were at Fort William McKendree. And notice up there was flying the Stars and Stripes, and it's not a 50-star flag. It's a different flag. And you probably now are going to know the rest of the story. The British would soon retreat, and Fort McHenry in Baltimore in the harbor withstood a massive British bombardment and inspired Francis Scott Key to pen a song that you know, the Star-Spangled Banner, except he just wrote the poem. Oh, by the way, do you know the tune for the Star-Spangled Banner? A bunch of Brits would get together in a bar, and they drink this, and they would sing to this song, which is almost impossible to sing. The melody, Star-Spangled Banner, is actually an old song sung by a bunch of British drunks, and that is the Star-Spangled Banner. It is September 11th, 1914, and the tide of the war changes when an American naval force under Thomas McDonough won a decisive victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh in upstate New York on Lake Champlain. And after that, it is all downhill for the British. A large British army under a guy by the name of Sir George Prevost was forced to abandon its invasion of the United States Northeast. They retreated to the Montreal area, which at that point was British North America, or particularly where they were, it was called Lower Canada at that time. Quebec. So they retreat, and that's basically the end of the war. Well, you got to negotiate the end of the war, and this guy, his statue is in Washington, is the guy who does the negotiations. His name is Albert Gallatin, and on December 24th, 1814, Christmas Eve, there's an agreement. It's back to the 1812 borders, and nothing happens. A lot of men lost their lives, but nothing really happens. They go back to their borders, the Brits north of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway, which was the St. Lawrence River in those days, and the Americans south of the St. Lawrence Seaway, or the river, and St. Lawrence River, and south of the Great Lakes. Although Windsor, Ontario is 1 mile south of Detroit, Michigan. Detroit's in the United States, and you go a mile south, there's Windsor. British gives up American land near the border of Great Lakes. The U.S. gives up Ontario, and again, Florida goes back to the Spanish. Florida went to the Spanish after the American Revolution in 1783, and it goes back to Spain as part of the Treaty of Ghent. President James Madison signs the agreement on February 17, 1850. Except nobody tells old Hickory, hey, the war is over. It took 2 months to find out that the war is over. That's what it did. The news came 2 months later. So, well, he's still fighting. The war is technically over, but he's still fighting. And so are the British forces, because they're not told the war is over. So they're going down to New Orleans, and there's going to be this big battle of New Orleans, which is unnecessary because the war is over. It's January 8th, 1815, and a large British army attacked New Orleans. It was decimated by an inferior American force under General Andrew Jackson in the most spectacular victory of the war. Well, all's not lost. I mean, at least for one guy anyway. This guy, Johnny Horton. You might remember him because in 1959, he had the big hit song, The Battle of New Orleans. In 1814, we took a little trip down the mighty Mississippi. That was Johnny Horton. And his next song was North to Alaska, which comes into play after a little while here. Meanwhile, that's Jackson Square in New Orleans, Louisiana, named after General Jackson. So, who won? Who won? Well, if you go to this cemetery in Halifax, where General Ross is buried, they will tell you, and because there's a glare, I have to come over here. Why aren't we Americans? The old burial ground remembers the War of 1812 through 1814. And they talk about the brave soldiers of not Canada, but Britain. But they don't give you an explanation as to why they're not Americans, other than they stood up to America, which is why Canada thinks it won the War of 1812, because they stood up to America, and America never invaded them afterwards. However, there were opportunities where that did happen, and in one opportunity, it actually did happen. So anyway, it says, this is the explanation. We are not Americans because of the service of men like the sailors and soldiers, casualties of the War of 1812, buried in this historic ground. They fought and died at sea and ashore to prevent the United States invasion and annexation of our country. Wait, annexation? That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Like, why don't we annex Canada? I thought I heard somebody say that recently. But there was no country of Canada. So this is kind of not right. It was British North America at that point. The invasion and annexation of our country. Well, the War of 1812 was a long time in the making, and I believe this one is up in Sault Ste. Marie when I was up there, and I think that's where that picture is from. It was probably the final act that started in Quebec and Nova Scotia about 55 years earlier. And some of you may have remembered the poem Evangeline. And you had to do that in school. Longfellow. I was in 4th grade, PS 151, 1964-65, and my teacher was Miss Alexander, who had to be 108 years old. She had the blue hair, she had the white blouse, the blue skirt. She always had a tissue here in case her nose ran. Real quick, she was able to do that. But she says to me one day, and I was a year ahead in school, so I should have been in 3rd grade, but I was in 4th grade because they threw me out of kindergarten. They had some problems with me, and after 9 days, they said, let's put him in 1st grade. And then the 1st grade teacher said, how about putting him in 2nd grade? And then he'd be 2 years younger than everybody else. That's not going to work.
I had the same thing.
Yeah, that's not going to work. But anyway, she said, you're a shy one. Why don't you memorize Evangeline and do it in front of the class? Except the class was in the auditorium of all the other 4th graders. And being that I was so shy and all that, I had to get up there and I did it. The only thing I remember is the Forest Primeval. But anyway, Evangeline, which is the tale of ethnic cleansing in Nova Scotia by the English against the French. Evangeline, the tale of Acadia, is a poem by the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that was published 1847. The poem follows an Acadian girl named Evangeline and her search for her long-lost Gabriel, set during the time of what was called the expulsion of the Acadians, except the expulsion really was ethnic cleansing. It was the forced removal by the British of the Acadian people from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and actually a part of Maine. And there is a park in Maine now called Acadia National Park. It was all part of Acadia. The expulsion lasted 9 years, 1755 to 1764. It occurred during the French and Indian War, which George Washington, by the way, started in 1754. He was sent to the British Crown to meet with Indians and French as far north as Erie, Pennsylvania. Something went wrong, and Washington killed the French emissary there, and that started the War of that starts in 1754. The 7 Years' War starts in 1756 and ends in 1763. In all, 14,100 Acadians in the region there, and about 11,500 Acadians were deported. That is Louisbourg, which the French built in 1730, the biggest fort in North America. During the 7 Years' War in 1759, the British, under the command of General James Wolfe, besieged Quebec City for more than 3 months. The French General Montcalm is killed on September 13th, 1759. This is up in Quebec City, and this is allegedly the spot that Montcalm was killed. Now, the French put up walls in Quebec City, but if you notice, the walls don't go the whole way around this hill. And down here is the St. Lawrence River, and the French felt that, well, we don't need the walls to go all around because this cliff out there, nobody in their right mind is going to climb it, so we're safe up here. Well, that didn't happen. The British did climb the wall, and they get onto a farm called, well, it was a guy named Abraham who owned the farm, and there's a 15-minute battle. Montcalm is killed, and the British take control over Quebec City and Quebec, and that changes part of North American history, because had the French held on and won, we'd all be speaking French probably now. French didn't have enough troops here. They were outmanned by the British. The city was defended by the French general, the Marquis de Montcalm. Very short battle, Plains of Abraham on the farm, lasted about 15 minutes, culminated in a British victory and the surrender of Quebec. And this is where it took place, right around here. That's the Frontenac, the Chateau Frontenac, the hotel, famous hotel there. And one other thing about this picture, somewhere around here in 1943, Churchill and Roosevelt meet with others, and they formulate something called Operation Overlord. The plans for D-Day in 1944, they're hatched in Quebec City in the fall of 1943.
Was in Quebec though French?
Yeah, it remained French, but I'll get to that in a minute, how it remained French. Anyway, so you can see how the cliffs look, looking at St. Foy the other way, but it's pretty much the same way here in Quebec City. The British and French coexisted in North America, but the threat of French expansion into the Ohio Valley caused the British to attempt to eradicate New France from the map completely. In the Plains of Abraham battle, Quebec City was permanently lost by the French. 1763, France formally ceded its claims to Canada, and Quebec City's French-speaking Catholic population came under the rule of the Protestant British. But they're watching closely in the South. You know where the South was in those days? It was south of the St. Lawrence River. And Maine in those days was Massachusetts. And New Brunswick was Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotia and Massachusetts basically bordered one another. Same people, you know, on that side of the river as this side of the river. They know England on this side of the river has won in Quebec, and they chased the French out of Nova Scotia. England pulled their best troops, and that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. And this is a place in Boston, this restaurant. And if you want to spend $10, maybe more right now, you walk off Atlantic Street, you come to this restaurant, and for 10 bucks you can go on one of these two ships and throw tea into the harbor and have your own Boston Tea Party for 10 bucks. Or you could be like me and flip a tea bag off of Atlantic Street into the water and say, hey, it's the Boston Tea Party. Now you asked about French, right? The Quebec Act, passed in 1774, allowed its les Canadiens, Quebecois, to have religious and linguistic freedoms to openly practice their Catholicism and use their French. The Canadians were therefore not unhappy enough with British rule to choose to participate in the American Revolution. See, they hated the Brits, but they hated the Southern colonists even more because they thought the Southern colonists were godless hedonists, and they couldn't deal with godless hedonists. The American Revolution from 1775 through 83 arose from the growing tensions between the residents of Great Britain's 13 North American southern colonies. There were actually 16 colonies. Nova Scotia, Lower Canada, Upper Canada. They were 16. Vermont, that was an independent republic at that time. So you had 16 colonies in this little area of Vermont, which was its own government. So the 13 North American southern colonies were not happy with their colonial government, and that was the British Crown, so got to get rid of the British Crown. Skirmishes between British troops and colonial militiamen in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts in April 1775 kicked off the armed conflict, and by the following summer the rebels were waging a full-scale war for their independence. France entered the American Revolution on the side of the colonists in 1778, and what had been a civil war becomes an international conflict. That's me and the Liberty Bell way back when, 30 years ago, because I had hair and all. I was complaining. I said, why don't you fix that crack in that bell? Shouldn't you fix that crack in the Liberty Bell? No, we can't do that. Oh, yeah, but you can't use it if there's a crack in it. It's staying here. It's still there with a crack in it. Nova Scotia was in a dither whether or not the colonies should join the southern colonists in their defiance of Britain, and there were two battles that took place during the American Revolution in British North America. The Battle of Fort Cumberland in 1776 and the Siege of St. John in 1777, which now is part of New Brunswick, but part of Nova Scotia then. Back in the old rocking chair of Nova Scotia. By the end of the war, Nova Scotia had outfitted a number of privateers to attack American shipping. British military forces based at Halifax succeeded in preventing American support for rebels in Nova Scotia. George Washington could have had Nova Scotia on a silver platter. He didn't have money for it. He didn't have money for bullets. While the British captured many American privateers in battles such as the naval battle off Halifax, many more continued attacks on shipping and settlements until the final months of the war. The Americans beat the English in Yorktown in 1781. The war is just about done. England goes back to fighting France in Europe. The fragile United States begins a new life. And this sounds more like New Year's Eve, Auld Lang Syne, than it does a peace treaty, but I'll read it to you. Treaty of Paris, 1783. American and British negotiators signed a treaty ceasing hostilities and recognizing America's independence. The war formally ended in the Paris Hotel on the morning of September 3rd, 1783, when both sides signed a treaty pledging, sounds just like Auld Lang Syne. Forget the past misunderstandings and differences. Forget it. Hey, just because a whole bunch of people got killed, forget it. The treaty recognized the colonies as the United States of America, established boundaries, and guaranteed that both nations would enjoy free passage on the Mississippi River. Only about 2 or 3% of the people living in the colonies were actually affected by this. Didn't matter if you were a slave, if it was England or the United States. Didn't matter if you were not a landholder, you couldn't vote. Only the landowners and the people with money, it mattered, because the people with money did not want to pay taxes. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold, is he a hero or traitor? Benedict Arnold. Well, Benedict Arnold's a traitor in the United States, and he's sort of a hero up in England. The Loyalists head to Nova Scotia. They're afraid that they're going to get killed. They're afraid that they're going to lose their land. So England says, okay, here in Nova Scotia, we're going to split it in half, and we're going to give all this land to the people coming up from what is now the United States in 1784. The Loyalists fled after the American Revolution. They were placed in what would become New Brunswick, land taken from Nova Scotia. St. John in New Brunswick would become Canada's first incorporated city. So, who won the War of 1812? Who won anyway? Well, the War of 1812 was a 32-month military conflict between the United States and Great Britain when its North American colonies and its native allies. On June 18th, 1812, President James Madison declared war on Britain over issues of maritime free trade rights on the world stage, British impressment of American seamen, along with a strong desire to expand U.S. territory across the borderline into British North America. The war was fought in three distinct ways: on land, on fresh water, and on sea. Casualties of the war tallied at 11,300 Americans, 8,600 British, and about 10,000 Native Americans or First Nation members. Many thousands of lives were lost, and to present present day, the debate continues who actually won the war. Well, we know who lost the war: the Native Americans. They had no protection anymore, the tribes. The War of 1812 is the last conflict. No winners, no losers. But to the victors, they write history. And that is why present-day Canadians think they won the war. The United States gave up on northern expansion, at least on British soil in theory. United States, England, may be friends, may not be friends. Who knows? Napoleon from France escapes Elba. The French and English are back at each other's throats on February 26, 1815, and Andrew Jackson finds other things to do. Well, the United States and England friends? Maybe. Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe. Upper Canada, which is Ontario now, was firmly established as part of the British Empire. Americans have no claims to that anymore. They beat the Americans, beat because the Americans never invaded again. The Americans were done fighting with the British Empire, a win-win for both sides. It was the last major confrontation between England and America, and ended in 1815. Most but not all territorial disputes were settled. Canadians and Native Americans, or First Nation members, saw the war as a decisive turning point in their losing struggle to govern themselves. Eventually, Canadians would go to Prince Edward Island and discuss their destiny, but all was not well. These are the losers, Native Americans. And I was on an island I guess it was off one of the Great Lakes, and we went to a presentation, First Nations presentation, where they talk about what happened as they give this presentation. For First Nation or Native American tribes, many of whom had fought alongside the British to block American expansion, the war left a terrible legacy. With Native Americans weakened and without the protections of a European power, the war set the stage for American expansionism westward for decades to come. The British citizens eventually would rebel. That would be about 1837, which is about 60 years after Nova Scotia had a chance to join the United States. Quebec never wanted to join the United States, and Ontario really wasn't all that developed at that point. But here are the rebellions that took place in 1837. During those rebellions, which took place in 1837 and 1838, Upper and Lower Canada, hundreds of armed citizens rose up against the government, protesting the injustices of the ruling elite. Sound familiar from like 60 years, 70 years earlier with the Southern colonists? Same thing. And demanding changes in the politics and economics of imperial rule in British North America. The revolt in Lower Canada, which is Quebec, was more serious and violent than the revolt in Upper Canada. Lord Durham comes over from England in 1838 and issues a report in 1839. He wants to know why there's rebellions. Well, I can tell you why there were rebellions. Those people felt like second-class citizens there. So he's there, and he wants to know what happened in the upper and lower colonies of Canada. Durham's report on the affairs of British North America led to a series of reforms and changes. Those included uniting the two Canadas into a single colony, the province of Canada. So you got Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the province of Canada. Durham proposed the creation of municipal governments in a Supreme Court in British North American colonies. He also wanted to resolve the land question in Prince Edward Island. His long-held plan for the union of British North American colonies was dropped because Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were uninterested. That is the Parliament building in Quebec City, and here's Montcalm and there's Wolfe, both of whom died in 1759. Durham believed that the problems in mostly French Lower Canada were ethnic in nature, not political. He found two nations warring in the bosom of a single state. He's also culturally biased against French Canadians. This phrase would be used by Henry Ford later on, about 70 years later, to describe Jews. But Lord Durham is talking about Quebecois here. He called them a people with no literature and no history. He recommended assimilating them by uniting Canada in a way that would allow the English-speaking majority in Upper Canada to dominate. Durham's report was condemned by Upper Canada's Tory elite. Reformers in Upper Canada and Nova Scotia hailed the idea of responsible government. Nova Scotia always dithered. They almost went with the Southern colonists. Over time, Nova Scotia wanted to break away from England, and Joseph Howe would lead the way in 1848. Well, there could have been another war, the War of 1839, between British and American citizens, and this comes really close to a third war. That is St. John, New Brunswick, that is City Hall. There was a northern boundary dispute. The precise boundary line between Maine and New Brunswick remained a matter of often heated arguments for years after the close of the Revolutionary War. The dispute festered and smoldered until 1839 when it threatened to erupt into open warfare. The Maine legislature that year raised funds to support a military force of 10,000 to protect the state's border claims at Madawaska. Several hundred British regulars were dispatched to the scene from Quebec. At this point, the U.S. Congress entered the picture, proving $10 million, which would be $338 million today for military expenses should a war break out. Nearly 50,000 American troops were ready for action, and Major General Winford Scott was dispatched to the scene. Scott managed to work out a temporary solution between the two parties before the so-called War of Aroostook reached the point of bloodshed. So possibly a war there. And there could be another one. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842, negotiated by the Secretary of State Daniel Webster, settled a long-time feud over where Maine ended and British North America or New Brunswick or eventually Canada began. Then a couple of years later, 5440 a fight. We want that Pacific Northwest land, or Pacific Southwest land, if you were in England. Anyway, 5440 or fight, let's go all the way up to the Alaska border and make that American. In 1818, the United States and Great Britain established a joint control over the Oregon Territory, the region west of the Rocky Mountains between 42 North, which was the border between Spain and then Mexico and the United States area over there. And 54 North, the southern boundary of Russia's Alaska Territory. By the 1840s, joint control had broken down, and the expansionist Democrats, including their 1844 presidential candidate James K. Polk, claimed the entire territory for the United States. The expressionist design was expressed by Polk's famous campaign slogan, 54-40 or fight. The slogan became a rallying cry of settlers into the territory. Popular phrase was picked up from Senator William Allen of Ohio, who coined the expression in 1844 on a Senate floor speech. The dispute was settled in 1846. And the United States would get Portland, Oregon as part of the settlement. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 partially delineated the northern U.S.-Canada border, but left the border of the Oregon Territory unsettled. This is the Columbia River, and the Brits wanted to go as far down as the Columbia River, which is in Oregon, and the United States didn't want to give up that land. The Oregon Territory existed from August 14, 1848 until February the 14, 1859, when the southwest portion of the territory was admitted to the Union as the state of Oregon. The region divided the UK and the US in 1846. The area includes the states of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, as well as parts of Wyoming and Montana. This is Windsor, Ontario, and this is looking south from Detroit. There are Canadian cities south of the US border. Let's get away from it all. Nova Scotia became the first colony in British North America and in the British Empire to achieve responsible government, January-February 1848, and became self-governing through the efforts of Joseph Howe. Nova Scotia had established representative government in 1758. I was up in, that's the border of Montana and Alberta, and I was up there going into Canada, and I asked the border guy, I said, what's the fence for? He said, to keep the cattle from going from one side, the Canadian side, to the American side. Okay, that makes sense. That is the whole border up in Montana and Alberta, just a little fence. This is Sault Ste. Marie. This city is one of the most important industrial cities. It's a twin city. Sault Ste. Marie, US, Michigan, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Canada. And a lot of goods go through these locks. And this is the largest area of transit between, well, actually in Ontario, all the way out to the Pacific coast. The capital of Canada is in Ottawa. And why Ottawa? Not Kingston, Montreal, or Quebec City. All because of American considerations. There's Quebec City, Quebec, Seaway. They're not getting it. There's the walled city. They're not getting it. It's too French. Kingston, too close to the United States, right over the border, and it's also called Kingston. You're not going to go there. Montreal, too French, not going to go there. New Year's Eve, 1857, Queen Victoria, as a symbolic and political gesture, was presented with the responsibility of selecting a location for the permanent permanent capital of the province of Canada. But it was the Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, that was assigned the selection process to the executive branch of the government, as previous attempts to arrive at consensus had ended in a deadlock. The Queen's choice turned out to be a small frontier town of Ottawa for two reasons. Ottawa's isolated location in that country, surrounded by dense forests far from the American border, 41 miles, filled with malaria. They figured, oh, you can get malaria there, so nah, they're not going to come. And it was situated on a cliff, and it would make it more defensible from an attack. And there is Parliament up in Ottawa, and you can see it's up on a hill, Parliament Hill. There was another war, and this war lasts 13 years between the British and the Americans. And it's roughly in that area, which was at one point joint area between the United States and England. The wording of the Oregon Treaty was vague when it came to the channel which separates the continent from Vancouver Island. because there are several navigatable waterways between Vancouver Island, that's where Victoria is, and the mainland. Ownership of the San Juan Islands remained contested. In 1859, a pig wandered from the British-Canadian side to the American side and was found in an American settler's garden. The pig was shot. The British demanded compensation, and American troops were sent to occupy the island while British warships patrolled offshore. The dispute would take 13 years to settle. They were ready to go to war after a pig was shot, a Canadian-British pig on an American piece of land. That is Victoria. Anybody been to Victoria? Victoria's great.
Where's that near?
Victoria's on Vancouver Island. It's near Seattle and Vancouver. It's on an island, and it's gorgeous. And the joke is, Victoria, it's a place for the newlywed and nearly dead. It has more senior citizens per capita than any other place in Canada because it never snows in Victoria. And the summers, it never gets above 75 degrees. And it doesn't really go below 40 degrees in the winter. So for Canadians, it's an ideal place if they have not the snowbirds going to Arizona or Florida, although I don't know how many are going to be going this year.
Loads of Canadians go off.
What?
Florida. Loads of Canadians go where I live in Florida.
In Florida, they may not be back there this year because of the tariffs and everything else. So, anyway, Canada becomes a country in 1867. It is the biggest trading partner of the U.S., no matter what is being said. That was the 150th anniversary of Canada when I was up in Vancouver back in 2017. So why is there a Canada? Well, here's the reasons. Political deadlock resulting from the current political structure, demographic pressure, population expansion, economic nationalism and the promise of economic development, an intercolony railroad which would improve trade, military movement, and transport in general, cancellation of the Canadian-American Reciprocity Treaty. We're talking about this in the 1850s, tariffs and trade wars between Canada, well, Britain in those days, and the United States. Gee, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? A free trade policy whereby products were allowed into the United States without taxes or tariffs starting in 1854, which was then considered beneficial for Canada. In 1865, the United States, partly as revenge against Great Britain for unofficial support of the South in the American Civil War. So that's why you had that treaty canceled. The possible threat of invasion from the U.S. Canadians had fended off American invasions during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, incensed by the Alaska Purchase of 1867, which was proposed, supported on the floor by the U.S. Senate by Charles Sumner, among others, precisely in terms of taking over the remainder of North America from the British. Canada starts in Prince Edward Island. And Prince Edward Island, you used to be able only to get there by boat. Now you can get there by car and a bridge. And that is one of the sculptures in front of Confederate Hall, which is where Canada started in Prince Edward Island, 1867. Time to form a country. In 1864, 23 representatives from the Maritimes, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island meet in Charlottetown to discuss the formation of the country. It was the beginning of the discussions that would lead to the eventual formation of Canada on July 1st, 1867. John Gray, meet John Gray. Hamilton Gray, meet John Hamilton Gray. There were two guys named John Hamilton Gray, and I can't figure it out. I don't know which one is which. But there are both of them hanging out on the street in Prince Edward Island. In September 1864, Prince Edward Island hosted the Charlottetown Conference, which was the first meeting in the process leading to the Quebec resolutions and the creation of Canada in 1867. And they meet here in that place. Prince Edward Island, though, doesn't join Canada, even though they host the conference. They don't find the terms of joining favorable. We're not going, we're going to stay as a colony of the United Kingdom. But oddly enough, Prince Edward Island was thinking about going to the United States. In the late 1860s, the colony examined various options, including the possibility of becoming a discrete dominion. That wouldn't work. There were no people that lived there. As well as entertaining delegations from the United States who were interested in Prince Edward Island joining the United States of America. And then we could have gotten potatoes. Not from Idaho, but from there, because that's their biggest thing. Prince Edward Island would eventually join Canada in 1873, and part of the reason was the Canadian Prime Minister MacDonald said, if they go, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are going to jump to the United States. We won't have a country. So Canada formed 3 months after the purchase. Russia sold Alaska to the U.S., so Great Britain wouldn't get it. Russia needed the $7.2 million, giving 2 cents an acre, about $153 million a day, or 42 cents an acre today. Russia needed the money after the Crimea. We're still talking about Crimea War all these years later, right? It's 2025, and we're talking about Russia invading Ukraine by the Crimea. Nothing changes, does it? Nothing changes. From 1853 to 1856. The northern colonists began seeking their own country in 1839. Prince Edward Island, Charlottetown, that's the beginning of Canada. Canada entered World War I in 1914 when England got involved. Canada entered World War II in 1939 when England got involved. 1931, Canada achieved near total independence from the United Kingdom with the Statute of Westminster in 1931, and full sovereignty was attained when Canada did the Canada Act of 1892, removed the last remaining ties of legal dependence on the Parliament of the United Kingdom. It took 51 years for Canada to figure out how to break away from England. Canada is a federal parliamentary democracy and a constitutional monarchy with Queen Elizabeth, now King Charles head of state. The country is officially bilingual at the federal level. And Queen Elizabeth was very well liked. July 1st is a national holiday, but in Quebec, Saint Jean-Baptiste Day is a bigger holiday that takes place on June 24th of each year. So is Canada going to become the 51st state? Well, that's Mark Carney. He is the Prime Minister, and that's Trump there. And Trump this week, let's throw a 35% tariff on Canada. It seems like there's been a war, economic war in Canada since January 20th. In 2025, United States President Donald Trump called for the annexation of Canada, with Canada becoming the 51st state. Canadians boycotted everything American, including travel to the States. The Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, said Canada is not for sale. So who won the War of 1812? To be determined. Any questions, any comments?
Well,
It's your
I thought
turn.
it was only on sea, that it wasn't on land at all.
Yeah, it was on land. Some of it was on land.